Hello, everybody, and welcome to Loudoun Agile Network. You're here today for our monthly meetup. Loudoun Agile Network, we invite thought leaders, authors, enterprise coaches, and super agilists to our meetup to share their wealth of knowledge, their experience, and help us learn and grow together. Today, we have with us George Lively, who is an Agile consultant at Lightspeed, with over 2 decades of experience in Agile software development, and mainly focused on extreme programming, Scrum, SAFe, CI/CD, and DevOps. Our speaker today has managed and coached Agile teams, serving in many capacities such as a technical lead, Scrum Master, and a build manager, with a focus on developing people and improving how teams work together to achieve results. So enough of reading, let me say a few things from my heart. He is one of the best chefs who makes the best pies in the world. So I happen to work with George, and he has brought his beautiful pies, and I'm sure he follows a very agile process for making them. So without further ado, please help me welcome coach, chef, an amazing human being, George Lively.
I'm blushing, Toby. Thank you very much. I appreciate your welcome, and you and Lakshmi and Anju have been very welcoming and very nice to have me here. Tonight we're going to be talking about example mapping. Oh, I can't share my screen now. I guess, can you make me co-host again?
Yes, we'll do right.
Thank you. Yeah.
There you are.
Thank you.
Sure.
So tonight we're going to talk about discovering requirements BDD style, BDD standing for behavior-driven development. And one thing that I work with Lakshmi and Toby at Freddie Mac and worked with a whole lot of teams there. And one of the things that I always try to do is to bring behavior-driven development along with a lot of other practices, but that's one of the ones that I try to introduce to teams the most. That's the topic for tonight. So I think it's about time to get going. But before we really talk about the heart of the matter here, I want you all to take a little bit of time and look at this picture that's over here on the left. And you don't have to wait until the end of my presentation to start talking. If you want to ask some questions, that's fine. But I just kind of want to engage in a conversation with y'all too. So look at this picture and tell me what you think's going on with this team right here. What do you think's going on? And to kind of give a summary, you see a business owner and a business analyst on the left, and then you see a developer and you see a tester, and then over on the right, you see a customer, and there's some stuff going on. But what does this process look like to you?
Everybody's working in a silo.
Yeah.
Waterfall?
And waterfall comes up a lot when I ask this question. And it's not, I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say that this looks like waterfall. And of course, the silos is a really great way to describe this too. Now, of course, I have worked with some Agile teams that have their silos and might even look like they're working in mini waterfalls all the time. And they might be arranged in sprints. And so maybe their waterfalls last 2 weeks. But the fact of the matter is that once the requirements, the stories come to the team, individuals kind of go to their own individual corners and work on their own. And then at the end, maybe the customer gets what they want and maybe they don't. So this might wind up with understanding what the customer wants and delivering something that's good, but it doesn't guarantee it if you work in this manner. And maybe it is a 2-week waterfall and you can find out quickly, but there's probably a better way. So what does this picture now on the right look like? Anyone have an idea?
There's one source of truth.
Yeah, and it's something that if you're looking at the middle of this, it's something that everyone has agreed on. So instead of the silos that were recognized on the left, really have Scrumfall?
Yeah.
Why do you think Scrumfall?
Because there is develop, so it starts as a waterfall while gathering the requirement, and then when it go into development, you will start doing sprint and working in agile.
Yeah, I don't think that this would be a Scrumfall on the right. In fact, I think this really is probably a more ideal depiction of what we really should be shooting for in an agile environment. Because what you have right here in the middle is you have your developer, your tester, your business working together to understand and do some continuous discovery on your requirements and to formulate some really good rules and examples that can then be transformed into some commonly understood structured specifications. And I think that this kind of collaboration without the silos, it carries a much greater guarantee that you're going to wind up with a delighted customer on the right. Because this is a very customer-centric way of approaching things, very highly collaborative. And so that's really what we want to achieve when we're doing behavior-driven development, BDD, that kind of continuous collaboration, customer centricity. So what is BDD? So this is a nice definition right here. It's kind of wordy, has a lot of stuff in it, but it is collaboration and conversation to discover essential requirements and identify uncertainty using rules and examples expressed in a common language to build a shared understanding and to deliver software that matters. So a lot of stuff in there, but there are some really specific words in here that I think really resonate with me. Collaboration, conversation, of course, being super key. We want to make sure that we're having that collaboration. And we want to be able to discover these essential requirements together. And really the whole process that we should be going through in software development is really a continuous discovery process. There's never any time when we should feel that we are 100% certain about what the requirements are. So engaging in that conversation is necessary. Distilling them into rules and examples that are expressed in a common language. That common language meaning something that everyone across the whole team can understand. That becomes key to delivering the software that matters. So BDD is really about bridging that communication gap, making certain that we have an ubiquitous language that spans business, development, testing. We don't want our specifications to have too much business lingo. That leaves developers and often testers behind. If our requirements are expressed in a way that is too technical, then that also can lose a lot of people on our team. So we want to make sure that everyone, the whole team, understands what is necessary in order to proceed. Okay. So, that's kind of a lot of stuff about BDD. Now it's kind of important to understand what the BDD process is. And the reason why I want to talk about one particular part of this tonight is because I often see, even in teams that are writing their stories with Gherkin syntax, that often the Gherkin syntax is not the product of that collaboration, of that conversation. And it's often expressed from one perspective and one perspective only, which then doesn't achieve the noble goal of bridging that communication gap. So where we're going to be focusing tonight is really on the discovery part of BDD and understanding what the acceptance criteria are using a process called example mapping to really nail down early on what the acceptance criteria are. When you have done that, then you go and you can start formulating some of those gherkin scenarios that many of you may already know about, but they are expressed in a syntax that follows that given, when, then syntax. Those can be automated. Once they're automated, we can use them to validate what we may or may not have discovered at the beginning and use that as feedback. But tonight really is about the discovery process and understanding the acceptance criteria using a technique called example mapping. Okay, so example mapping is really the subject matter for tonight, where we're going to be talking about understanding requirements, BDD style. I believe that this is a really, really important technique. And as you'll soon see, it is a structured way of visualizing what your user stories are and doing it in a really low fidelity way that can help drive the conversation without muddying the conversation unnecessarily with some of the very structured nature of given, when, then. Okay. So let's start with understanding that in the discovery process, we want to have the three amigos. And the three amigos are business, developer, tester. We want to make sure that we have at least those three perspectives represented. And when we have those three perspectives represented, we should have a really good, common, shared understanding forged for what the story is going to be about. And when we come out of this discovery process from these three amigos, we should all be in agreement on what it is that is going to be implemented. Essentially, the business is going to make sure that whatever story emerges is valuable. The developer is going to ensure that the story is feasible, and the tester is going to ensure that it is testable. It's not to say that you can't have more amigos present. There might be more perspectives that you need to have at this, but the recommendation here is to have at least those three so that you can get that kind of real value from this conversation. Okay. And so how we want to achieve that is really to illustrate what the rules and examples are in this conversation. We'll start with a user story with some sort of basic idea of what the acceptance criteria are, very broadly, very generally, and start having the conversation and ask, well, what are some of the rules that have to be represented here? And the rules in this context are your abstract descriptions. And you can very much think of them as what the developers are going to be coding. Okay. And once you have a knowledge of what those abstract descriptions are, then you can get into more concrete scenarios that would illustrate what those rules are about. You can see right here that if I have a story about a shopping cart, I might have a rule, an abstract rule, that says if a reader buys 3 books, then the cheapest of the 3 should be free. And while that might be some pretty nice basic information, it could be very helpful as part of the conversation to come up with a very specific example of what that might look like. And the example here, a very concrete one, is that I have 3 books in my shopping cart. One is $10, one's $15, and one is $5. And at checkout, my total will be $26.50. Now, if you're good at math, and you don't have to be all that good at it, you might notice something weird there. And what might be weird about that particular example there? Any ideas?
The total is, so add taxes, I guess.
Right, exactly. And so what I want to be able to illustrate here with this particular set of rule and example is that part of the conversation, and really where we want to discover some of these things, is that someone, whether it's a developer, tester, business, whoever, might say, oh, we've already developed this other requirement that says that we have to calculate sales tax on this. So yeah, the subtotal might need to be $25, but at checkout, we need to add sales tax. Therefore, the total needs to be more than just $25. It needs to include that. And here it would be $26.50. So it's not simply good enough to have a conversation illustrating a very simple rule like this. We want to make sure that you're able to discover all of the other things and include that in something that is testable. Okay. So what then would an example map look like? And here's, I think, a nice example, as it were, of an example map. So the idea here is, and you can do it in Mural, any kind of whiteboarding tool. You can do it on a flip chart with Post-its. It doesn't really matter. The idea is to be able to illustrate your user story, rules, and examples in a nice, easy way that facilitates the conversation and gets people moving. So at the top, in something that's like a yellow Post-it, orange, or whatever, you have your user story. And then below that, in your blue stickies, you have the rules. And those are, as I said earlier, your abstract acceptance criteria that would really drive what the developers are going to develop. Okay. And then under that, you have green Post-its that would represent the concrete examples to illustrate that rule. You can have as many as you need. And often there are questions that come up, and those would be in red or pink or purple stickies, whatever color suits your fancy. And the questions could be about anything. They could be things that would help you understand really what the boundaries and constraints of the story are. They might be things that maybe the business doesn't really understand the answer to, might have to go back and get some clarification on. They might be some things that developers might have an inkling that might have been developed in part or not at all, and maybe there's some need for more analysis. Maybe there's a testing technique that a tester needs to do some analysis on in order to help with this. Who knows? But the questions are there to really get a handle on what some of that uncertainty might be and see if there needs to be some clarification. Okay, so it's very simple. Orange Post-its for the story, blue Post-its for your rules, greens for your example, reds, pinks, purples for some questions. And I should note that this is a technique that was pioneered by Matt Wynn, and it's been adopted by a lot of BDD folks out there. Is a really great way to get that conversation going. Okay, so here's a concrete example of an example map. So let's say that we have a story that is requiring us to develop some sort of an algorithm to validate whether a password is easy or not to crack. And the first two rules in the blue Post-its are that it must have at least a minimum of 8 characters, and it has to be alphanumeric with at least one special character. And if I were presented with this as a developer, I would think, this really isn't sufficient to get me going. I probably need a little bit more because I'd want to know how to test this. Even as a developer, I always ask, well, how do you test this? Because I want to know what the terms of confirmation are. And that's where the green Post-its come in. So those are going to be, again, the concrete examples to illustrate the rule. And what's really nice here is that I can represent both happy path scenarios and negative scenarios here. In fact, I should consider both sides of that. And clearly the first one on the left, foobar, that's 6 characters. It's invalid. It's too short. So that's a nice negative scenario to illustrate the minimum of 8 characters rule. And then the one over to the right, a happy path scenario, actually illustrates nicely both rules. It obviously goes above and beyond the minimum of 8 characters, but it also is alphanumeric with at least 1 special character. So you have the zeros, you have the exclamation point, you have characters, all of that stuff is all in there. So that's really great, but there might be some other things that have to be considered. Like, is there a maximum length constraint? And that's going to be in a red sticky because maybe at this point the business person doesn't know what kind of a maximum length validation should be there. Also, it could be useful to know about some other negative scenarios. What about if there's no number or no letter or no special character? And what I want to illustrate with this particular example posted is that there's no really specific syntax for how you should record these examples in your example mapping session. I can resort to what some would call the Friends episode format, where it's the one where this has happened and that and the other, and everyone who's in the session understands intuitively what that means. I don't have to go to some sort of nth degree to micromanage exactly what that example is going to be. This kind of shorthand is good enough. Okay, so that's an example of some examples with some really good shorthand. The kind of Friends episode is what it's often referred to as. Okay. Maybe a developer asks, well, shouldn't we require a mix of uppercase and lowercase? I mean, that is often part of the validation. And so that's a great question that raises some level of uncertainty. Maybe we need to do a little bit of analysis on that. And then there's this scenario, with a lot of repeated characters. That's often part of some validations on passwords as well. So after all of those questions are asked and answered, we come up with this particular example map. You can see that the second rule over has been amended to indicate that mixed case is now required. And that forced us to make some modifications to some of the examples. So capital F for foobar gobble is now a happy path scenario to reflect all 3 of the rules now. And I also have some negative ones for invalid repeating and all of those things. And then maybe there are other questions that come up about dictionary words and all of that. One or many of the great side effects of this is that by visualizing it, you can, as a team, see things that are represented here that might not have been apparent had you not gone through this method of doing example mapping and visualizing the rules and examples that'll be necessary for you to get to that point where that story is doable within a couple of weeks, right? So with that in mind, if you were to do example mapping and at the end of it you had a whole lot of red cards, the questions, what do you think that would mean as it relates to this story? Any thoughts? I would think it would mean that there's still a lot of uncertainty around this story. Maybe the business doesn't have a good handle on what the true boundaries of this story are. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done before it can really be pulled into a sprint, right? What about if there are lots of blue cards, and those are the rules? If I have a whole bunch of those, what do you think that would mean to you?
It's too restrictive. There's too much specificity.
Well, yeah, there are lots of rules, right? There are a lot of rules that have been specified. And it could be an indication that this is really big. And maybe it would be a good idea to split it. And you could identify some of those areas to split the stories along the rules. So this can be a really great visualization technique to show you how big the story is. And so you can use it to split it into multiple stories and maybe implement it over more than one sprint. How about greens? If you see a lot of green cards, what does that mean to you?
There are a lot of examples available.
Yeah, so what I see happen a lot with teams is that they don't necessarily talk about the testing effort in as great detail as maybe they should. And when you do something like this and you see all of the green cards that come up, that could be an indication that the testing effort on this is, sizable. And what it could mean too is maybe it means that the rules have been expressed maybe too generally, and maybe it's a good idea to break up your rules into multiple rules so that maybe that would indicate too another area where you could split some things. So the greens could help you understand that maybe you have more rules in here than you actually thought at first, and it's actually going to be a bigger effort than you thought, and you could find some simple test cases to test at first and have those go against a couple of simpler rules, and then have the more complex test cases and the rules that go along with them in separate stories that get implemented later, right? So what you have here with example mapping is not just a great way to articulate what the rules and examples are, but also to really understand from the whole team perspective what the size of the effort's going to be. That can be very powerful, I think. Any questions so far? All right, so it's time for a little Mentimeter quiz. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'll pop into the chat what the code is. It is 46939442, but I'm going to shift over to another screen. I'll make sure that you still have that that code. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a little quiz about what are rules and what are examples. Make sure that you understand the differences. Some people coming in here. I have a good number of people in here. I'll start the quiz. You can do this on a phone, tablet, laptop, doesn't matter. All right, we're at double digits, so I think I'll go ahead and start the quiz. All right, we answer fast to get more points. Sales tax of 5% is added to the purchase amount. Is that a rule or an example? All right, everyone's voted. Yes, it is a rule. Almost all of you got that right. It's a bit abstract. It's not a specific example of what would need to be done. It's just a rule that any developer could code to, and that's why it's a rule rather than an example. Next. All right, getting more people here. For an item purchased for $12, sales tax of 60 cents is added for a total of $12.60. Is that a rule or an example? All right, very nice. Yes, and its example, it's very specific about a specific item being purchased for a specific amount of money, and therefore The illustration of that is that this would be the total for that specific purchase. Therefore, an example. Very nice. All right. If an avid reader buys 4 books in 1 month, the cheapest of the 4 should be free. Is that a rule or an example? Okay, very good. This one can sometimes be a little tricky. I didn't trick very many of you. Sometimes this little adjective of an avid might seem like a more concrete example, but it is really expressed as a rule to define who that avid reader might be. 4 books, 1 month. Therefore, the cheapest of the 4 should be free. Okay. All right. This is the last one of the quiz. The one where the customer forgot their credit card. Is that a rule or an example? Ooh, that's an even split. So if you remember back to that example map where I had different examples about the one with no special character, the one with no number, the one with no punctuation or special character, whatever those were expressed as examples. It's a bit of a shorthand. It's that Friends episode type of example. And that's really what we're going for here is you'd say, oh, well, there's that one where the customer forgot their credit card. And it should be an illustration of a rule. And so those of you who said example, you got it right. It is tricky though. And that's pretty much why that's there. Okay, so the leaderboard, who did the best? Agent X9. There is no prize as far as I know. Maybe Toby wants to round one up for you, whoever you are. Congratulations, though, you did a great job. And that is the Mentimeter quiz. So good job on that. The next thing is actually going into Mural, where we don't have breakout rooms tonight, but we can do all of this together. And so the idea is, and I'll go ahead and share the URL with y'all on that one. Let me stop sharing this for a second. I'll pop that into the chat as well. And all of you can come in should you desire to do that, but I'll also go ahead and share my screen and we can talk through this together. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at one particular story and together we can construct an example map around it. So the idea here is in this particular map, we're just going to start with breakout number 1. We can choose this story right here. All the stories that are in this particular mural are around some very basic stuff about handling bank accounts. There's one for depositing funds, one for withdrawing funds, one for transferring funds, and one for setting up a savings account for automatically covering overdrafts. And so for this particular one, where I too represent the business and represent being the product owner here, I would say that this story is really about, I have some money, I want to deposit funds into an account. What you should probably be considering, among other things, is whether there are limits on the amounts that can be deposited, whether there are limits on the number of deposits that I can make over a specific time, and whatever other rules we want to put in place. So, keeping in mind that the blues are for rules, the greens are for examples, the pinks are for questions, I'd love to hear from y'all. You can put them on the example map yourself, but I'd love to hear from you what maybe some rules are And what I will say too, as a word of caution, especially if and when you want to present this within your own teams, is that sometimes it can be difficult to be able to tell the difference at first between rules and examples. Sometimes teams get that wrong, and it's okay. And it's okay if teams struggle with this at first. Over time, you should be getting better at it. But maybe the first example map that you do could take about an hour for a team to get through. And the team might think, oh, can't believe it's going to take us an hour for every story to do example mapping. That seems like a waste of time, too much time for that. One, I think it's not unusual for it to take a long time the first time. As you get better, you'll improve on that and get to around anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes per. I'd also say that you don't have to do example mapping on every story. As a team, you can figure out which ones are maybe a little complex and need to have this level of conversation devoted to them. But then the final thing is that even if a team does devote a little bit of extra time on something like this, that common understanding that they forge should go a long way towards saving time later on when maybe something gets implemented incorrectly, or maybe it wasn't super testable, or you didn't understand the level of effort it was going to take either on the development side or the testing side. So even a few extra minutes, 15, 20 minutes extra, can save a lot of time down the road, okay? So with that in mind, I think y'all have had a little bit of time to look at this. That's a great question from, I think, Visiting Panda. Is this a savings or a checking account? And I would say that as the product owner, I would assume that we are depositing funds into a checking account, and this third story where we can transfer funds between the primary and savings account, it would imply that there is another savings account. So I think that that's a question I can safely answer. But let's talk about some rules. What are some rules that would help us to develop this story? Would it make sense for us to create a rule around some of those questions that are at the center of this about limits on amounts? And if there were a limit of, say, $10,000 in one day, or $10,000 on a single transaction, that's not too uncommon. How do you think you would express that as a rule? Thank you, Visiting Panda. Things are getting very busy on here. Let me move this out of the way. There's something about withdrawing, but let's not talk about withdrawing right now. We really want to focus on depositing. So we're really only going to deposit funds into this account. No more than one deposit per week. That's a pretty, that's a strict rule there. If that's the rule, I guess that's the rule though. Okay, move this. So maximum deposit amount is $5,000 per day. Okay, so let's work with that. What would an example look like? Because I think that that could be very interesting. Okay, So yeah, account holder has it tries to deposit $5,001. Then yeah, that should be a negative scenario. I could even create a little thing to indicate that that's not allowed. Here we go, piece of icons. All right, so that would be a negative path scenario, right? So instead of saying transfer, because there is a story about transferring funds, and we're not going to work on that one today, but yeah, let's say depositing $4,100. That would be acceptable, right? So that would be good, and that would be a single deposit. Each one of these is a single deposit. It's saying in the rule, though, that the maximum deposit amount is $5,000 per day, which would lead me to believe that I could break up this into multiple deposits and still either be under or at or above that rule, right? So I could have another example that says first deposit equals 4,000, second deposit equals 1,000, third deposit equals $1, third deposit is not allowed, right? So I think that would be a good illustration of that rule. We could have others as well. So you have no more than 3 deposits per day. Okay. What was that? Okay. So right there, that's a nice also an illustration of, on one hand, let's actually, that would be fine for that. I could also have something here that says maybe the second deposit's just $100. The third deposit is 900, and fourth deposit is 1, and then the fourth deposit is not allowed because I'm not allowed more than 3 deposits per day. Okay, so right here we have some examples, some happy path, some negative scenarios to illustrate a couple of these rules here. So a nicely expressed rule there, maximum is 5,000 per day. Another rule, no more than 3 deposits per day. And these examples here are going to be good for illustrating a couple of things here. There's a rule that's come up here. You can deposit cash by physically visiting a local branch of your bank. Okay. Do these other rules still apply, whether you're doing it physically or virtually? That would be interesting to explore. But this is generally the idea. It's a rather simple way to illustrate this conversation. Examples down here, rules. When you have happy path scenarios, they should be valid across all the rules. That's one other thing to consider. Are there any questions before we move on for just a little bit of things to wrap up? Okay. So with that in mind, going back to here. So we covered this. Oops. And so I want to wrap up with a nice little quotation that I find inspirational from High School Musical. And it's on the power of multiple perspectives and teamwork. So everyone is special in their own way. We make each other strong. We're not the same. We're different in a good way. We're all in this together. I think that's a nice way to sum up the power of behavior-driven development and example mapping through a Three Amigos, where you bring together people of multiple perspectives to understand what your user story is really going to be all about. Okay, and here's some nice additional reading that you can have to learn a little bit more about example mapping and BDD. And I would also like to point out that, again, I'm George Lively, and I'm with LiveSpeed. LiveSpeed, outside of the Loudoun Agile Network, we have our own meetup. It's the DC Lean plus Agile meetup, and there's a QR code for it. I encourage you to join us. We also have some very interesting speakers showing up at our meetups every month or every couple of weeks, actually. So that's it for me. I open the floor up for general questions. Anything you want to ask about this or that or the other?
Thank you, George, for awesome presentation. I'm pretty sure everyone learned a lot. I did. So now the floor is open for questions. Feel free to ask or type it in the chat window, whichever works best for you.
I'm not seeing questions, but a lot of thank yous and great session, George.
I
I
see.
loved it. I really love the Minty.com questions. Those are really tricky.
And the man
Example versus
whose
role.
name, George Lively, was very lively.
You are lively.
Well, thank you. I saw a really good question from Charles. I guess it's direct to me, but can BDD go along with TDD? That's a fantastic question. In fact, the answer is yes. A little history. TDD, test-driven development, is an agile engineering practice that emerged from extreme programming, XP, very dev-centric, where developers are expected to write their unit tests first and use those to drive the development of their code. BDD emerged after that as somewhat of an answer to it and a complement to it, because some people wanted to do some form of test-driven development, but also make it a little bit more friendly to the whole team, not so technically oriented. And so behavior-driven development is a way of bridging that communication gap and having a whole team approach to understanding how your user story will be tested and confirmed. A lot of times your BDD scenarios as executable specifications that come out of that conversation from example mapping or whatever, they can be used as scenarios to help developers understand what behaviors they want to test in their unit tests. And if you test them in your unit tests, then maybe you don't have to have some automated acceptance tests for them. A team engaging in a good conversation there can avoid the redundancy that some teams often find when they test at unit level and at the acceptance level, essentially the same behaviors. So yeah, that's a great question. BDD and TDD often go hand in hand and complement each other.
Thank you very much, George.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
If no questions, I'll ask one.
Sure.
So often hear people say that, hey, we don't have budget for automation testing. But we see them spending so much money, burning money on manual testing, which sometimes is inconclusive, or like they're just adding more and more money into manual testing. But they're like, we don't have budget for automation testing. So what are some ways in which we as coaches or scrum masters can convince our bean counters and the financial people that automation testing, although it might cost a little bit upfront, can help save us in the long run? What are some of the things that you do or say to convince people?
Well, I mean, first, I would say that to start off, there's nothing in BDD that requires that you take these test scenarios and automate them. I would never say that I'm going to actively discourage teams from automating their tests. I think that's the best step forward, but you can use these scenarios to even drive some of your manual tests. Having said that, of course, most teams that do these manual tests are going to probably execute their manual tests multiple times. Automating it, of course, makes it so that every subsequent time you would have executed that test manually, you don't have to have people taking the time, the effort, the money in order to do that themselves. And so these test scenarios that we build up, especially when they're automated, wind up serving multiple purposes, which can save a lot of money and time for people over the course of a project or a series of product developments. These tests do form kind of a living form of documentation, especially as you automate it. You should be able to detect if you have broken any of the observable behavior of your system, and that living documentation that exists in your tests that are now automated will help you go and fix those things much more quickly. They'll provide much faster feedback, and you'll be able to avoid a lot of the stagnation part of what happens in a lot of teams. The more you're able to automate and build that into the overall team process, they'll be able to develop more and better functionality over time, the more they've been able to automate these tests.
Gotcha. Great answer. So one additional thing that I do whenever people think about budget is show them some case study from the same organization or a similar organization, and that normally instills a lot more confidence as well. All right, great. Back to you, Anju.
So I do see another question. Do you recommend team does example mapping during or release planning?
So that's a fantastic question. And the answer is that you can do it at multiple levels. There's nothing to say that you have to do example mapping at the story level. You can take example mapping to understand a larger group of functionality, whether you call it a feature or an epic, and you can break those down into rules and examples as well at a much larger level of granularity. And that could help you at something like release planning, right? My typical recommendation is to try to start at a kind of a lower level and focus on stories. I think it's an easier thing to digest. And I would recommend that teams do that before sprint starts. So at backlog grooming, story refinement, or even at a Three Amigos session, that would be maybe part of a pre-story refinement session. That's a great place to start with it too.
Another question, do you use tools to link stories to test example scenarios? Where and how do you document these?
That varies a lot from organization to organization. A lot of organizations do have the capability to link stories to tests, test scenarios through the Atlassian suite. So you can have Jira linked to Bitbucket, and Bitbucket can link to some of your feature files where you can use the annotations to link your scenarios and things in your feature files directly back to stories. But that's really going to be something that's on an organization by organization basis, and will depend on whatever your tool set is and whatever the organization has enabled for you through those tools.
Thank you, George. So I do not see any other questions in the chat, and this brings us right on time to wrap up the session. Thank you, George, once again for a wonderful session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this last few days of summer. Folks, please sign up for our next upcoming session of LEN, which will be on Thursday, September 21st. We are bringing another great speaker, Bhavani Krishnan, and she is going to talk about why organization agility is imperative. Again, September 21st, the event is published. Go ahead and sign up. See you folks very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, George. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Excellent.